Okay, so we're going to resume. We've got our courses page working. We've used our navigation property so that we've got our department name showing up. So what we want to do now is build, I think I should get a 404 when I click Add Course. Yeah, I do. What we should get when we click Add Course is this page. So we want text box for title, text box for credit, and we want to have a drop-down list. So I'll give you a few hints, and I want you to try and build this page yourself. So you're going to add a new page called course.aspx. It's going to look like this, so you'll need two text boxes, one for title, one for credits. If credits has the type equals number, you'll get this auto-generated by your browser. And then we're going to want to use an ASP drop-down list. Now, we played around with these back in weeks 1 or 2. We played around with the drop-down list, but we just hard-coded some options into the list. We didn't make this a data-bound list. So there's a few things we need to do. How can we get it so that when we say we want to add a new course, what things will we need to do in order to get this list populated? There's a couple things we'll have to set in the HTML, and there's something we're going to have to do in our code behind page. So what are we going to need to do in order to get this list populated? Won't do it itself. So that's going to be one thing. When the page loads, yep, if it's not posted back, let's run a query on the departments table, similar to what we did. You know, really we can use the same query that we've used here. Instead of binding that query result to a grid view like we did on this page, we're going to bind the query to a drop-down list. So the syntax for doing that's the same. Now our department's query, when we run it, our department's query is going to get, our department's model has 3 columns. If I open up my model file, we've got the ID, we've got the name, and we've got the budget. So how should we use these columns in our drop-down? We can't use all of them. Which columns do we need for this drop-down list? And how should we be using them? We've got a department ID, we've got a department name, and we've got a budget. Yeah, so we'll want to use the department ID as the value, and we'll want to use the department name as the text. If we look at the source of the page, so here's our drop-down. So I've created a drop-down called DDL department, so it's an ASP drop-down list, and we're using the department ID as the value, and we're using the department name as the text. So when you create your ASP drop-down list, there will be a couple of properties you want to set in the HTML. One that sets the department ID as the value, and another that sets the department name as the text. And then, as Kevin said, you'll want to write a query in the C# that binds this list to our department's query when the page loads. Okay. So take a few minutes. I'll show you what we need to do in a bit, but see if you can get this page to load and your drop-down to populate. So this is the output. This is what your page should look like when we're done. So here's my basic form. Text box, drop-down list. I have a basic query in the back end that says when my page loads, if it's not posted back, get the departments. This is really the same query we ran on the departments page. And I'm just binding my drop-down, setting the data source equal to my department query to a list, converted to a list, and calling data bind. But when I run it, I get this. What else do I need to add? So in my HTML, we need to set a couple of the properties, right? Because our query fetches 3 columns, department ID, name, and budget. So we need to tell the dropdown specifically how to use those 3 columns. So which properties do we want to set specifically? You're close. The key ID is in a grid. But you can see both the properties we need in the context menu right here.
Data source ID?
Good guess. We don't need to set the data source ID because the data source is already done in C#. We're already doing that part, right? We're setting the data source at runtime right here. So we don't need the data source ID, but we've got 3 columns in our query. We only need 2 of them, so we need to tell .NET how we're using those 2 columns. Close.
Data source ID. Data text field. Data value field.
Well, we'll want the data text field. That'll indicate what column is being displayed. So what column should we set as the data text field? The column called name. So that's what the user will see. What's the other property that we should be setting? You got it, Mallory. We want to set the data value field, so that's which column will actually store the values. So what column should that be? The department ID. Because when we save a new course, the course table has a department ID foreign key field. So we're going to show the user the friendly name, but when they pick a course, we're going to store the ID number instead.
And required? Or is it default?
Well, if we just fill the list, it's going to default to the first one. So we don't necessarily need a validator in this case. So now it fills in the names of our departments, but even though the user sees the names, the dropdown is going to use the department IDs as the value, which is what we want. So when we hit save, we can interpret, we'll read that ID, and we'll save that as the department ID value for the new course. So the code is identical whether we're filling a grid or a dropdown, because .NET, they're both considered list controls. So they both have a data, both a grid and a dropdown have a data source property. They both have a data bind method. The only 2 other attributes we need to set are these: the data text field and data value field. So we know which column is being used for the values and which column is being used to display the options to the users. So once we have this running, the other thing we want to do is write a save operation so that if the user adds a new course or edits, we can save those changes to the database. So on my save button, I've already generated this save click event handler. If you don't have it, you can either double click the button in the designer or just type on click equals and choose create new event. Either one will write the btn save click in your C# for you. So we should be able to load the page if you go to courses now in your project and click add new course. Your page should look like this, and your drop down should get populated from your departments table. Before we move forward, is anybody having a problem or question about the drop down, or is it working okay for you? Yes, it would work for you if you didn't take a 25-minute lunch and a 10-minute break.
Yes, exactly.
Mine's not working.
There are some problems I cannot solve. That would be one of them.
I didn't get the code yet. You switched so
So I have this empty save handler. We should write our save code so that it can do both an insert or an update. So we can just do this part together. You've already done this a bunch of times, so there's really nothing new in the save. So we'll create a new connection. So first we want to check whether we're inserting or updating, whether we have an ID in the URL or not. I'm going to show you a slightly different way. This is probably a better way than what we've been doing so far. If I look at our department page, where we did edit a few weeks ago, we were just checking whether we had any query string value. This is probably not the most efficient way, because we could have a query string value, but it may not be the value we're looking for. The user could just type in their own query string on the end. So not only should we be checking for a value, but we should be checking for a course ID value. So here's how we can do that. So we'll use a not, and there's a string function called is null or empty. So if our request.query string called course ID is not null or empty, this means we're editing. We have a valid course ID in the URL, so we want to grab that ID. So we'll grab the course ID from the URL and convert it to an integer. Whoops, sorry, that should go. So if our query string course ID is null or empty, we don't have a valid course ID, so we're going to do an insert.
Do you need the two strings at the end of that line there?
Good question.
All the other examples in here don't have that.
Okay, I guess by default that is a string, so yeah, we could leave it out. I'm in favor of less typing, not more.
I get departments.
And actually, we'll just create a variable here of type course. So we'll instantiate a new course. If we have an ID and we're editing, so we'll populate the existing course So this is the same as what we've done on our other pages. So if we have an ID, we'll populate our course object with our existing course. If we have no valid course ID, we'll just create a blank one. So we'll populate the course from the input form. So we'll set the title from our title text box. We'll set the number of credits from our credits text box. And now we need to set the department ID from our drop-down. So what property of our drop-down list will show us the value that the user selected? What we actually want is either selected item.value or selected value. Selected index will just give us the position in the array. So the first option would be 0, 1, 2, 3. We actually want the department ID number. So we can use selected value. Now notice selected value is always treated as a string. So we have to convert it to an integer. Even though they're numeric values, if I leave out the convert to int32, compiler won't be happy. It says we cannot convert a string to an integer. So even though we're filling those values with integers, Visual Studio assumes that they're strings. So we're still got to do the type conversion. So I picked selected value. Now, Kyle, you suggested we could use selected item.value. That works as well. They're equivalent. Right? Again, I'm always in favor of less typing. Nope. No difference whatsoever. And they're both treated as strings. Even if you use numeric values, you have to convert them.
Selected item dot whatever, just for some value.
Yeah, so if we wanted to use selected item, right, we also have access to the text property. So let's say we wanted to send a confirmation. There's no point showing someone the department ID. Let's show them the friendly name so we could show them the text instead. So now we've populated our department name, our credits, and our title, and now we can do the save. So now we'll check. Well, we can check our query string again, or we could check our course ID. I guess we'll just say if string.is null or empty. So if we have no existing course ID, then we'll add our new course to the courses collection. And either way, we'll save. So we'll call save changes, and we'll take the user back to our updated courses page. So we don't need to call add. We don't want to call add if we have an ID, because then that will add another record. So if we have an ID, we just want to change the properties and call save. Now this will allow us to add. Our edit is incomplete because we're not populating an existing course if the user has clicked edit. So we'll add that as well, but we'll try this out and make sure we can at least add a new course this way.
Let me scroll back up to the department thing. For some reason, mine's not populating.
So I'm going to recompile, and we'll see if we can add a new department. Sorry, if we can add a new course to an existing department.
You scroll down, just go one second. To the second, that one, okay, just. Thank you.
I still don't see what I
Are you getting an error?
want. No, it's just not populating.
So there are no items in the drop-down list.
Yeah.
Ah, you're probably missing this. You're probably not calling the function when the page loads.
Yeah.
So if it's not post back, you want to call your get departments function.
Post back with the full thing.
If it's not post back.
Post back option, post back there.
So if I go and try, I'm going to try and add a course now. What have we got? So I'm going to create a course. I'll call it thermodynamics.
Oh, what are you doing?
3 credits, and this is an engineering course. We'll see whether this adds it, whether our code's right.
Now I'm getting an error.
So now we've got it. So it is adding, but if I go to edit, we are getting a course ID, but we've got a blank page. So we do need to add a few lines on here to populate the form if the user clicks edit. And then we'll also need to make sure when they edit, so if I go to edit thermodynamics, this drop-down should pre-select the engineering option. So we've got a get departments method. I'm going to add in here a get course method. So we will populate the existing course for editing. Whoops, and this should be void. So we'll connect first. So we'll grab the course ID from the URL, convert it to an integer, and we'll write the same query we wrote down in the save. So this will look up the existing course through Entity Framework, and we'll populate the form. So we'll set the title. So this will put the title in the title text box, It'll put the number of credits in the credits text box. How are we going to set the drop-down option? So we've got our DDL department.
Dot selected value is equal to the department language.
We can try that. I'm not sure. You know what? This is a bit misleading. If we look at the help, when I type selected value, Visual Studio says it gets the value or selects the item in the list that contains the specified value. This should work. We'll try it, but I think we're going to have to use one of the other properties. Theoretically, it should work. I don't think it's going to, but we'll try it.
That's the problem, though, theoretically.
Yeah, so let's set the selected value equal to objc dot department
We'll have
ID.
to convert it to a string first.
Okay, we'll try it. So this should do our lookup. When should we call this method? So we've already said if post back, get the departments, that'll fill the drop-down list. Then we also want to fill the form if we have an ID. Which should happen first? Should we fill the drop-down list and then look up the course? Or should we look up the course and then fill the drop-down list?
Fill the list first.
Why do we need to fill the list first? Right, because otherwise, we need that department drop-down populated so we can pick the right option when we're showing the course. So we're going to call get departments first, and then on page load, get the course if editing. So now we can again check if is null or empty. Sorry, if it's not null or empty, our course ID, then we'll call get course. So that'll do our lookup with Entity Framework and populate our page. Kyle?
Is not null or empty within a session variable?
I believe so. We can try that in a bit because we're going to use a session variable when we do our column sorting. We'll want to keep track of which way are we sorting, ascending or descending, so we can toggle that value, right? If we sort ascending when we show the grid, the next time our query runs, we'll want to sort descending and vice versa. So we will use a session variable for that. So let's try this. I'll compile my code. I'll go in and try to edit. So if I edit my new thermodynamics course I just created, my drop-down, we want it to default to engineering. We may have to change how we do it. Okay, so that did seem to work. So we get the title, we get the credits, we get the department. I better make sure. Okay, actually the selected value does work, so that's simpler. I pick a math course, my drop-down defaults to math. So we always need to fill the list first and then set the selected value after. And setting it, the selected value of drop-down this way is much, much easier. If this was PHP, we'd have to loop through all of the options and then compare our current department ID to each one of the options and add a selected attribute in.
What if you have more than one value to select?
In a drop-down list, then what you have to do, the drop-down list, you'd have to change text. Hang on just a second. You'd have to use an ASP list box instead. This doesn't allow multiple selections. A drop-down doesn't allow it. If you programmatically set more than one option to be selected, you'll get an error. It'll say you cannot have more than one option selected in an ASP drop-down list. Sorry? If it was a list box, then you would have to use a loop for that. So populating a drop-down list on a blank form is pretty easy, really the same as populating a grid. And populating it and selecting on an existing record is really the same. All we need to do after we populate it, we just bind it to a data source, and we can set the selected value property. Are there any questions about what we've done on this page with the drop-down list?
Yes, why is it different?
Do you get an error?
Yeah,
What does it say?
I think we think it's a 404.
Well, what does the message say? Okay.
An exception was of type system web HTTP exception occurred in system web DLL but was not handled via the code.
No, never mind.
I will have to have a look at it.
It's pointing to my data bind.
You're still trying to populate the drop-down list?
Yes.
Okay. Check carefully your code if it's different at all than what's on the screen. Anybody else have any other questions about using the drop-down list and binding it to the database? Yes, it is cold in here. Sorry?
I said that's better than not.
It is. It's true. When it's too hot, everybody's like,
Keeps us on edge.
okay. You know, they do say the Georgian dress code is layers. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a pause here. We'll take a 10-minute break. So when we come back, what I want to do is we want to look at how we can go to our courses grid. So how on this page, I want to enable paging, so our grid shows 3 records at a time. That's pretty simple. We just need to set a few properties on the grid and add a couple lines of code in the C#. That's simple. Then we want to add the sorting, so that we can both sort up and down, and we also want to include this little icon that includes the direction and add that to each column. Okay, so that's a useful piece that we're going to need, but we're going to need a fair bit of code on the grid to be able to do that. So we should be able to get the sorting and paging working before the end of class today. I don't think we're going to get into this part, building our courses grid on the students page. We'll probably have to leave that for next week, which is fine. But the sorting and paging, we should be able to get working today. Okay, so we will take a pause here.